Hey everybody, this is Josh Mancy with Corn Belt Newsletter, Farm Realtor here in North Central Iowa. I have the distinct honor to introduce Chad Hart, ag economist from Iowa State University, who's going to give us a small presentation. We say small, on what's happening in the world of agriculture. Chad, why don't you take it away, and we'll kind of just have a dialogue as we go, and then we'll questions as well.
Sure. And Josh, feel free to jump in at any time. Because, yeah, knowing me, if anybody's seen me before, I love to show slides off. And so
And we
we're going
love
to
you
use
for it.
those slides. So let's see here if it's going to behave like I want it to. There we go. Nice big slides.
Beautiful.
So we're going to talk about what's happening in the crop markets and where trade is at. And we're speaking at an auspicious time. Yesterday, President Trump announced the new tariffs coming on, and they're everywhere. And what's that mean for us as we look? Well, let's look at where the ag markets are at today. When you're looking at, for example, the U.S. corn market, you look back over the past few years and you look at the projections here for the 2025 crop year. And what you're staring at are some of the biggest crops we've ever had. In fact, for 2025, USDA says we'll plant somewhere north of 95 million acres of corn, which is up nearly 5 million acres from what we just planted last year. You put a trend line yield with that acreage, and what you're staring at is 2025 could be the biggest crop of them all. So we've had plenty of corn to work with. That means, though, we need to find plenty of uses for corn to help try to keep prices up high enough where it makes sense for us to grow that corn. That's where the gray box on this table comes in. That's the corn usage, the demand side of the market. And when you look at what we're seeing in 20, for the 2024 crop and the projections for the 2025 crop, what you're seeing is usage is at the best level it's ever been. We've never used more corn than we're using right now. But when you look at where's that usage been growing over the past couple of years, arguably the big growth area has been exports. And that's why these tariffs are such a large point of discussion right now. If where we're getting growth is selling to the rest of the world, and now we're putting these tariffs in place, and those other countries are likely going to respond with tariffs back on U.S. stuff, it possibly limits and maybe undercuts the growth that we've been experiencing in the export markets. And especially if I'm going to have another great big crop here in 2025, I need all the usage I can find right now. As you look at what USDA says for 2025, they say there's a potential we could produce 15.8 billion bushels of corn. And even though I'm at record usage right now, record usage is only at 15.1 billion bushels. So that says if we don't find an additional gear there to use up some more corn, we're looking at stocks building and prices continuing to fall as we look out there. And corn's not the only place where we're worried about that. Arguably, soybeans, I'm sort of in a similar boat. In this case, while soybeans is going to see less planted this year, we still may produce just as many beans this year as we did last year. And we've had, again, very strong production for the past few years. So, just like in the corn market, we've got plenty of beans to work with as well. And it's the same thing. When you're looking for growth in usage for the soybean side, we're seeing growth in exports right now. Now, it's being paired with some growth here domestically when we look at domestic crush, but arguably, in order to keep up with our ability to produce soybeans, we do need to see continued export growth there, especially in this case because soybeans is a crop that we do tend to export quite a lot of. If you look back at, say, 2021, you'll see that we exported roughly half the crop that year. Even as we're looking at 2024 crop, and that's the year we're in right now, you can think of it as if we have soybeans to sell, those came from the fall of 2024. Well, we're exporting about 40% of that crop. So exports are a major point of emphasis for crops like soybeans, like cotton, and that's why they are even more sensitive to tariff discussion going on right now. Now, when we look at the acreage for 2025, what we are seeing is everybody's running the corn right now. The idea is the reason being, I believe, is because corn has had the more explosive growth when it comes to exports over the past couple of years. And the corn market has figured out a way to, if you will, grow despite some tariff issues and trade issues with China. Now, as you look at this map, this is USDA's map, and basically any states that are colored in blue in this case, that's indicating corn acreage is going up. Any states in pink or red, corn acreage is going down, and if it's gray, no change in corn area there. But as you can see, across the corn belt and down in the south, you see a lot more corn being planted. Basically, corn is gaining land that soybeans and cotton is giving up right now. And I think this is a play by producers to, one, go to the crop that's having the better exports right now, but also going to the crop that is less reliant on those exports as well. In the corn market, we tend to export 12 to 15% of our production. Soybeans, we tend to export 40 to 50% of our production. And cotton, we export 75 to 80% of our production. So you can think of it as if your crop's more trade sensitive, yeah, farmers are likely moving out of that production in 2025. Here's the soybean map just to show you that shift there. And you can see again, there's a lot of red now in the corn belt. So you can see a lot of movement going on here. I'll point out that the one state that's sort of counterintuitive here is Ohio. You see, Ohio's pulling back on corn, increasing soy. I always like to have the exception to the rule. In this case, I'll describe it this way. I think what you're seeing in Ohio is sort of a idea of that when you've heard about, when everybody gets in a crowded theater and the alarm goes off and everybody goes charging to one main door. Which door should you be running to? The opposite door. In this case, everybody's charging the corn. Well, Ohio producers are like, hey, maybe we should go to beans instead. It might work out for them. I think there's the possibility of that, especially if we do see as few soybean acres planted as being projected here. But yeah, it's a big shift to corn, especially from soybeans and cotton right now. All this is happening in the face of a drought as well. So the drought, let's face it, this has been the drought of 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023, 2024, and now 2025. Um, and while we've had this drought hasn't it hasn't significantly impacted production over the past few years. In fact, if anything, this drought has sort of eased concerns within the marketplace about droughts because we've been able to produce, like I say, some great big crops over the past few years, despite having droughty conditions for 5 years in a row now. And in fact, as we look at places like Iowa here, the drought is still here, but it is getting better as we look over the past few weeks. As you look here, most of Iowa is either under what's known as D0 or abnormally dry conditions. So we're not officially in drought. That's the yellow areas in there. And then the tan is moderate drought. So the first stage in drought. So we had been seeing more D1, D2 level drought as we move through the winter. That has been easing as these last few storms have come in. And it's sort of setting up a weather pattern somewhat similar to last year, where if you think about it, last year we started the year in drought. We saw some good moisture move in the latter part of the springtime, basically just in time to muck up some planting and create some flooding in northwest Iowa. And that moisture helped us get that crop off to actually a fairly good start. And that ended up carrying us to some really good production in 2024. Well, could we be setting up that same story again here? And at least the early indications are we're at least on that same sort of pathway right now. We'll see if it continues to play out that way. But when you think about it, and I'm going to sort of harp on trade a lot with this talk here, you also need to think about, when we're talking about trade, we're talking about moving products around the countryside. This is a graphic just to show folks just when we talk about moving a barge or moving using a unit train, just how big is that? What this basically shows, this is a comparison of various things here. And my favorite thing to pick on here is if you think about one barge, so one boat on the Mississippi River, that one boat is worth about 16 rail cars or about 70 semis moving down the road. So that tells you that one boat is moving a heck of a lot of material. Now you put one 15 barge tow together, and that's moving 216 rail cars or over 1,000 trucks. So what that tells you is we think about the Mississippi and the Missouri River and the way that we move corn and soybeans, down the river to reach those export markets. Each one of those barges is carrying a tremendous amount of product. And we're moving a lot at that time. And not only are we moving those corn and soybeans down the river to reach markets, we also got to think that some of our inputs come up the same way. In fact, I just recently went with my class over to visit a co-op location, and we were talking about fertilizer and discussing how fertilizer gets from various places throughout the globe here to central Iowa and how it, depends upon the transportation system we've got here. Now, those transportation systems, they do cost, and one of the things that is right now in our favor as well is those costs have dropped compared to, say, last fall. This is one of the reasons why I think we have seen a pickup in our export pace in a lot of our commodities. Our cost to get to the global markets has been reduced. That means that we can price well and sell into a lot of these good markets here. And as you can see here, those costs dropped mainly when you're looking at ocean freight, when we're getting to the barge and the Gulf Ocean things. But we have seen smaller drops in what it costs to move by rail and by truck as well.
Chad, is there any reason behind that?
Probably the biggest one here, you can think of it as the drought conditions have improved, it's made it a lot easier to load these barges up to, let's call it more appropriate level. One of the things that you can think of here, and let me go back here. When you think about the drought like we've been having here, one of the ways it increases our transportation costs is because I'm not able to load the barge up with as much product as I want to. Because the heavier I make the boat, the deeper it sits in the water, the more likely it's going to run aground if the river's low. So what do? Well, we have to take that load that would normally go in one boat and spread it across two or three. And that's increasing the cost to move that product and therefore making it more expensive to try to sell to anybody else. So we have seen some benefit that way. We've also seen, basically in this case, especially as we look at like trucking costs, let's face it, diesel prices have come down over the past couple of years. That's been helping us as well. So we are seeing some improvements in our transportation cost. We've seen some improvements in our just logistical efficiency right now because there is more water moving through the river systems to help us move our crops to the international marketplace. And we're definitely seeing it when we look at how much is moving down the river system right here. What I'm showing you here is weekly data that USDA tracks, and this is on looking at just how much is moving through Granite City, Illinois. So think of this as just north of St. Louis. This is how much corn, soybeans, wheat are we seeing coming down the river. And as you can see here, the line gives you the 3-year average. And when you look at throughout 2024 and early 2025, our bars, we're doing more than the average right now. We are seeing more product moving out from the middle here of the U.S. out into the global marketplace. And that's been verified when we're looking at our sales as well. I'll skip these for a second to come back to when you're thinking about those global markets, though, you also got to compare who are you trying to compete against. And when you look at global supplies of corn and soybeans, they're a lot like U.S. supplies, great big supplies. 2023 was not only the US's biggest corn crop, it was the world's biggest corn crop. So everybody else also created a lot of corn. As we look at 2024, U.S. production fell, world production fell. But when I look at that foreign line there, which represents everybody but the US, notice that didn't fall much. So we continue to see our competition growing more corn. And typically, when we think of that competition, we think about places like Argentina and Brazil. And you can see them, their lines 4 and 5 on this table. And yeah, Brazil does continue to grow more corn. A lot of that growth is coming through their second crop corn, which they're doing basically is soybeans and then following it right up with a corn crop. And that's helping them expand their production. But we also see some exportable corn coming out of places like the Black Sea region, Russia, Ukraine. If you go about two-thirds of the way down the table, you'll see them. And so we've had a lot of competition from other places in the corn market. We have the same thing going on as you look at soybeans, where again, it was record production worldwide in 2023. But the difference is here, 2024 was an even bigger world soybean crop. And again, a lot of that growth is outside the US. And so when you're thinking about the world supplies, I would argue there's basically three parts of the world you want to watch. And so bear with me. This is where I'm going to jump back to this map.
I think this is a great chart or the great
Yeah,
map.
this is my favorite slide of all time, just because you can tell so many stories off of it. Because in this case, what this is a map of farmable land around the globe. The colors tell you two things about the characteristics of that soil. And you can see on the lower left-hand corner there, it tells you it's soil performance and soil resilience. What I really want you to concentrate on, though, is those bright green colors on this map, because those are highly productive, highly resilient soils. Well, there's the entire planet. How many big green spots do we see? Well, I would argue there's three. There's the one we live in here in the Corn Belt in the central U.S. Then you look down there in Brazil and Argentina, and there you see another big green spot. And then as you look over here in Eastern Europe, and that's basically the Black Sea region, Ukraine and southern Russia, there's the third big one. And so when you think about global agricultural production, arguably it's those three big green spots that are going to drive the supply side of the market. And arguably over time, those three green spots have concentrated on different crops. After all, you look at our green spot here in the US, and it's known as the Corn Belt. Corn's what we do. Typically, when we think of South America, I think the first crop everybody thinks about is soybeans, and they have become the dominant player there. And when you looked at the Black Sea region, well, that was known as the wheat belt for the former Soviet Union. So those, you can think of it as those three spots used to concentrate on different crops. Today, they all basically do corn and soybeans with wheat on the side, which means we're all in direct competition selling to the rest of the world. Because the other thing this map tells you is there aren't a lot of other places that can produce the bounty of crops that we can here in the central US, that we can see down in South America or in the Black Sea region. That when you look at countries like China and India and even Japan and South Korea, what you've got there is they don't have the same amount of farmable land. Even with the land that they have, it's not as productive, it's not as resilient, and therefore they're not as able to produce the quantity of food and feedstocks they're going to need. Where are they going to get what they need? Well, it's going to come from the green spots. And that's why when you think about trade, yeah, well, that's why we tend to think about Brazil and Argentina and Ukraine as our major competitors because they are. That's where the competition has to come from. And luckily, over the past few years, we've been gaining in market share as you look. Overall, when you look at the value of U.S. agricultural trade, this shows basically over my lifetime here. And you can see that trade values within ag have just dramatically ramped up over the past 50 years. So as we look today, whether we're talking about ag imports into the U.S. or ag exports out of the U.S., we're talking about roughly $200 billion a year these days. So There's an incredible amount of value in trade within agriculture. And like I say, it flows both ways for us here. You know, you can think of it as what do we export? Well, that tends to be things like corn, soybeans, beef, pork. What do we tend to import? Arguably, we import a lot of tropical products, things that we just really can't grow here. Like the US, despite, our love of coffee, we can't grow a lot of it here in the US. We can't grow a lot of bananas. We can't grow a lot of avocados. And so we depend upon other countries to provide those agricultural goods to us. While at the same time, too, we provide to them the things that we can do really well. Now, when you look at the mix of who's buying from us, I'm going to break it down into three big categories here. There's basically, in this case, the red line down on the bottom, that's China. And let's face it, China has been an incredible growth market for us over the past 20, 25 years, but is also a very volatile market for us. And you can definitely see the swings in that trade as we've had an on and off again trade dispute with them, basically going on since about 2012. You can see the depths of the trade, war that we had during President Trump's first term there with the dip there in 2017, 18, 19. You can see sort of the recovery that was during phase one, the phase one trade deal that we had with him for a little while. And now you can see us swooning back down again. On the other hand, if you look at our free trade agreement partners, so think of this as, we've got the USMCA with Canada and Mexico, but we've got about 20 other countries that have signed some sort of free trade deal with us over the past few, 20, 30 years. That's what's represented in the blue line there. And you can see that we've had pretty steady and significant growth from those free trade agreement partners. And I would argue that's what we would expect to see. The U.S. in an ag perspective, especially for things like corn, soybeans, beef, and pork, we are a high volume, low cost producer of those commodities. So it makes sense that we would be a natural trade partner for the rest of the world because that's what you want to buy. You want to buy high quality product at a fairly low price. And that's what the US can tend to offer. And then the green line there just shows you everybody else. And you can see that we've had growth there as well, but it has been more muted than what we see with our free trade agreement partners. Generally, what I would argue is that this graph shows that typically it's when trade barriers or tariffs are lowered that U.S. ag sees more exports and sees more growth in potential markets around the globe. Now, as far as looking at those agricultural imports we bring in, I mentioned a lot of them are tropical things. And so as you can see here, and this is data from 2024, about half are what they call horticultural products. So I want you to think flowers get included in this, but you also have a lot of, like I say, just sort of tropical fruits and vegetables. In fact, the next group is sugar and tropical products. So once you put those two together, you've explained nearly two-thirds of all the agricultural imports we take into the U.S. We do bring in some grains, some meat, some oil seeds, but they tend to be of a much smaller category when you look here. When you flip this around and say, okay, what do we export? You can see this is where grains, oil seeds, meats become a much larger part of it. Again, those products are the products we tend to dominate and tend to export a lot more of. I'll also point out in this case, ethanol has become an export market for us. So even as we look at biofuel development, we've seen that grow to such a level where it's not only just trying to meet our own domestic needs for ethanol, but we've been able to create ethanol and send it to other countries as well. We've seen growth there. So you can see that ag trade, it happens in both directions for us. I oftentimes get questions about that. And it's like, yeah, we'll import and export, especially with our North American partners here quite a lot. Sometimes it makes sense for if you're in North Dakota, maybe it's a little cheaper to buy a little bit of Canadian corn than to pull some up from South Dakota. And so you do see that cross-border trade like that. And that's what things like the USMCA agreement have allowed to flourish and grow. Now, when you look at the trade balance, I like to point out in this graph, it's probably the most complicated thing I'll show you here today. This is basically saying let's take each of those categories and see whether they create a trade surplus or a trade deficit. So as you look at this graph, the line shows you the overall trade balance for agriculture, and it has went from a slight surplus to a little bit of a bigger deficit over the last couple of years. Well, what's been adding to that deficit? Well, this darkish blue area there, that's those horticultural products. We've always been a net importer. That's just grown over time. The next green line down there on the bottom, well, that is from sugar and tropical products. But when I'm looking at corn, soybeans, beef, pork, that's on the plus side of the ledger. That's still adding to trade surpluses there. So corn, we're in a trade surplus. Soybeans, we're in a trade surplus. Beef and pork, for the most part, in trade surpluses there. And so, you know, I tend to argue the agricultural trade balance is more consumer driven than it is anything else. That especially as we look over the past few years, we've seen the ag trade balance move into a deficit. Why? Well, it's not that we're necessarily selling less to the rest of the world. It's that U.S. consumers are demanding more of those products that we just don't grow here in the U.S. Again, things like papayas and avocados and coffee. But overall, we balance some of that out by selling more corn, more soybeans, more wheat to those same countries that we get those tropical products from. In fact, when you look at our export sales on soybeans so far this year, they're up about 13, 14%. In this case, the key lines to compare here would be the green line is what we did last year in terms of exports, and the red line is what we're doing this year. Now, in this case, you can think of this graph as starting at harvest time, and we're tracking how that crop is moving through the export market chain over time. The black line shows you our 5-year average when it comes to export sales. So right now, things are improving, but not quite back up to average. Well, where are we getting that improvement from? Well, where we're getting that improvement from are places like Europe, North Africa, in this case, Egypt. In this case, I've got it labeled as other, but it's the smaller markets around the globe. Where we're struggling with sales right now are places like China, where, in this case, there's tariffs that have been added on. In fact, China was basically the first place President Trump hit with tariffs as he started his second term here. It's also the case of, remember those tariffs, that trade war during his first term? A lot of those tariffs are actually still in place as well. And so this shows not only, let's call it, the short-term impact of the tariff announcements this year, but it also shows some of the long-term ramifications if these tariffs remain in place over time. But overall, yep, soybean exports have been improving. And like I say, that's been a one big area of growth that the soybean market has had. Same thing is true of corn. We have seen not only have our export sales improved compared to last year, but we're well above average right now. We are sitting here right now with the third best export market in terms of bushels that corn has ever seen. We're moving a lot of product right now. And that growth has been almost everywhere. In fact, as you look at my chart here, all the lines are pointed in the right direction. They're headed higher. We are selling more right now into Mexico and Canada and Japan and South Korea and Europe. In fact, the only market where we're really down significantly is China when it comes to corn. But that loss in the Chinese market hasn't hampered the growth in corn exports. In fact, as we sit here today, corn exports are up 20 some percent compared to last year.
Chad, any specific reason for that?
I think there's a couple of things going on here. I think here, one of the big ones to me is, and this has been true and been building, especially since COVID. You've seen a lot of countries, we saw a lot of income growth within those countries. And typically, as incomes grow, consumption grows. And one of the biggest things that changes when your consumption grows is diets. You tend to improve your diet, and the easiest way that most people improve their diet is by buying up the higher quality protein. Well, how do you create that protein? Well, typically that means you're feeding animals to create meat. And so let me pick on a place like Colombia. As you can see in this graph, they're the third bar over there. That tells me they're the third biggest export market we have for corn right now. Why are they buying more corn? Because they're feeding their livestock industry to create more meat, to feed their growing population. And that population down in Colombia has more income now so that they have more money to spend on meat. And so we're seeing that sort of writ large, I would argue, across the globe right now. Now, worries about recession, especially now that there has begun, let's call it some serious discussion about how the global economy may enter a recession here as we go through this trade fight. If that happens, that's likely going to slow down consumption growth. And in fact, may even, eliminate it for a while. And so that's another thing that could hamper us here is that, if we do end up into a recession, that's going to slow down not only global consumers, international consumers, but that could also slow down US consumers as well. And so that is another big risk here is do we put the not only the global economy, but more specifically the US economy in recession as we go through this trade fight. But like I say, as you look here on the crop side, nope, we've got growth in exports. Now, in terms of on the meat side, it's a mixed bag here. When we're looking at beef production, for example, it continues to shrink. Um, Cattle herd continues to get smaller, mainly due to a couple of reasons. One would be the drought. If you don't have the grass, it's hard to grow a bigger beef herd. The other thing that's going on here is just the economics right now behind the cattle industry. Um, right now, what we have are incredibly strong prices for those animals. So if you're raising cattle, we're seeing some great prices out there. But we also know it costs a lot to create those animals right now, especially if you have to buy the feeder animals. If I'm buying calves or if I'm buying feeder cattle, I'm spending record amounts to get those animals on the farm to capture those record high prices once they leave the farm. And so that means that the profit potential has been limited when we're looking at the beef sector. Now, in the case of pork and poultry, we're not shrinking those herds. If anything, we're holding them fairly stable. But the idea is that the productivity we're finding with those animals means more and more meat is being produced each and every year. When I put this all together, what this tells me is that meat production writ large is basically flat. And it likely means that feed demand from the livestock industries is likely fairly flat as well. The idea is that until the beef industry starts to grow again, we're going to have a hard time seeing feed demand growth move much here within the US. Even though when we're looking, we figure, with steers averaging basically, in this case, this is USDA's number here. If you look at the 2025 forecast for steers, they're saying basically $2 a pound on average, and that's for the animal on the hoof. That is a record high average price. We would expect to see the industry start to grow then if you're capturing record high prices. But the reason it hasn't started that yet is because we're also staring at record high costs. So it is a challenge right now when we're looking at the livestock industries. There is some spots of profitability out there, especially if you're creating calves right now. You're doing really well. Calf prices are record highs. And so if I can create those calves at low cost, if I've already got those mama cows, in the herd and they're producing calves, they're worth their weight in gold right now. But if I have to buy those calves, that's where, you know, the numbers just aren't quite penciling out again yet. So, meat side, I call it, from a feed perspective, stable at best. Good, strong numbers, but stable. And when you look, that sort of makes sense because when we look at U.S. consumption of meat in total, it's pretty steady. The average person eats about 210 pounds of meat per year. That's been true for about the past 50 years. What has been changing over time is what meat they have at the center of the plate And what we've been seeing is a shift away from beef and towards chicken, which is sort of, if I take you back here, if you look at beef production, it is now the third largest meat when it comes to production here in the US. Poultry's first, pork is second, beef is third. Um, Beef is still a big part of the dinner plate, but it's more of, let's call it, it's what you break out on fine dining occasions. It's no longer the standard meat at the middle of the plate. That is now chicken. So that has changed the feed dynamics within the US as well. When you think about even in the meat markets, though, I have to talk about export share. If you look at our big meats, the idea is we export just like we export on the crop side, and we export a tremendous amount. In fact, if you look at the beef industry, 10 to 12% leaves the US each and every year. With pork, it's more like 25%. Even dairy is, a case where you don't think milk, we don't tend to think about international trade, but no, we export, up to 20% of all the milk that we create here, through butter, cheese, whey, those powdered milks. We are, like I say, a big exporter when you look across the board, the standard products, if you will, that we create here with U.S. agriculture. That's a case sort of writ large as you look out there. And what we've been feeding, or if you want to think of it this way, where we've been doing is we've been finding those markets where there's consumption growth going on. This is a graphic just looking at pork consumption growth within countries over the past 30 years, 40 years. This is on the pork side, and as you can see here, the idea is when you compare the U.S. growth rates in consumption to what's happening in other parts of the world, no, there's much bigger gains to be had selling pork into places like South Korea and Mexico because they are, they have this combination of populations are growing, incomes are growing, and in this case, they're getting exposed to the potential to consume more and more meat. And so you can see that, while here over the past, I guess this would be 35 years, pork consumption here in the US has gone up about 40%. When you compare that to what's happened in South Korea, where it's gone up by 250%, well, wouldn't you like to sell into that South Korean market? There's so much more growth there. And that's the other thing that trade brings us. It allows us to target those markets that are growing faster than our own domestic market. And you see that in pork. You see that in chicken. In this case, I'll point out that, India is one of those places that we've always sort of been watching on the periphery that I think will become a pretty good sized growth market over the next coming decade. That when you think about what we've sort of been through with China, and we always thought, big population and the population growth that, the income growth that they have there, that same sort of storyline can be told about India as well. And as we can see here, chicken consumption growth rate was going through the roof there for a while. Now, in this case, USDA no longer tracks that anymore. Not sure exactly why, but you can see that up until 2015, 2016, we were seeing tremendous growth there. As, Indian consumers, as their incomes were growing, their meat demand was growing, and most of that was being um, fed through chicken as we look here. Here's beef. And again, here's a case where India is our top line here. And we don't tend to think of India as a big beef market because they're never going to be. But when you think about the possibilities for beef sales into India, there are still avenues there. Even though, the let's call it the majority cultural practice doesn't eat beef, that doesn't mean that everybody in the country doesn't. And so that opens up windows of opportunity for U.S. export sales throughout the globe. When you look at the biofuels, as I mentioned here, what you're looking at is an industry that grew for domestic production, but now we've grown to such a level that we export ethanol as well. In fact, the U.S. is the biggest producer and exporter of ethanol on the planet right now. And when we look at where ethanol is right now, we're producing at record levels here as we look at, the winter of 2024-25. Corn usage is incredibly strong right now, but the place where we're seeing the biggest growth is in those international sales. We've seen other biofuels developing, things like renewable diesel. Those have been growing, but they're arguably the challenge now is, can you grow beyond the initial market that you're in? In the case of renewable diesel, the big market here has been the California diesel market, which is about 5 billion gallons. And the problem we seem to be seeing here is that the renewable diesel industry is sort of stopping and plateauing here at the 5 billion gallons. That we may not see much growth beyond this because of the challenge of developing these biofuels and expanding their market opportunities there. In fact, let me just throw this out as we think about, not only am I talking about renewable diesel here, but I want you to think about things like sustainable aviation fuel and what we're doing in the carbon markets here. The idea is we're trying to create additional value for agriculture to capture. And typically, we're thinking about expanding more of agriculture as an energy provider, hence the push into the diesel market, the jet fuel market. That movement offers tremendous potential to grow demand for agricultural products. At the same time, too, though, in order for that demand to truly be there and grow, we have to be able to create these biofuels in a way that makes them cost competitive in the fuel market. And arguably, that's the biggest challenge. And what we tend to do and what we have done in the past, and I would argue in this case, we'll go back to ethanol, it has been the example of what we hope develops here. When you think back to ethanol in the early 1990s, early 2000s, the idea is, as we're just trying to get the ethanol industry off the ground, the industry required a lot of government support in order to get things moving. But at that same time, too, when you think about, corn going into that ethanol plant, for every bushel of corn back then that you would put into an ethanol plant, you would get out maybe 2.4 gallons of ethanol. Well, today you put that same bushel of corn into an ethanol plant and you're going to get about 3 gallons of ethanol. What that tells you is we become much more efficient in creating ethanol from corn. That efficiency means that it costs less on a per gallon basis to create ethanol. And what that did is that helped lower ethanol's cost to where it could be more cost competitive versus gasoline, even without government support. And so then it could compete and grow within the fuel market. That's the challenge we right now face with biodiesel and renewable diesel. The challenge here, though, is that the cost of the biofuel is still above the regular fuel. And that's what's limiting the potential growth here. And that's the concern as we look at things like SAF. It's not the technical challenge of can we create that biojet fuel? No, we can. It's more, can we do it in such a way where it would make financial sense to use that biojet fuel? And, what sort of developments do we need to have happen there over time? And so let's call it a long-term aspirational goal, but it's not going to help us here in the short run as we look at what's happening with our markets. And so as we look at markets, this is where we closed out basically on April 2nd. And when you look here, what I got is what I traditionally call the slope of hope for corn. You see, as you look out over time, prices slowly trying to rise here. And I would say, as you look at the big black numbers there, what I've done there is I've taken those futures market prices, taken an average basis off of it to get back to a national average cash price for corn so that I can compare these numbers to what USDA is projected. As you look at the left-hand side, that would be for the 2024 crop, basically the left of that black line. The market's at 432, USDA's at 435. I would argue they're in agreement there. Where they disagree is for the 2025 crop, so right of the black line. The market right now is around 450. USDA is around 420. So the market's offering about about 30 cents more. Why would the market be offering that? I'm going to argue that it's offering that because when we're looking at the corn market, we do see that growth in export sales. And I think the market is hoping that despite the tariff back and forth that we've seen, that maybe that we can continue to build on that international demand to grow up and to continue to expand corn usage over time. Now, I've had some people ask, well, is that maybe just the drought showing up, and do we see a weather premium being built in here? And I'd always tell folks, well, it could be that, but if it's that, then I should see a similar sort of bump for soybeans because it would be impacted by drought the same way. Yet when I look at soybean prices, I don't necessarily see the same thing. In this case, while I do see a little slope of hope building in the futures, when I take into account basis levels, average basis levels, it brings it back down to where whether I'm looking at 2024 crop or 2025 crop right now, the market is saying $10. And to tell you the truth, that's right in line with where USDA is at for both 2024 and 2025. So, no, it's not drought. It has to be something else. That something else, I would argue, is the way corn exports, especially, have grown even faster than soybean exports. That has led to corn prices recovering more over the past few months than soybean prices have. And in fact, when I'm looking at the 2025 crop, I can argue that our cost structure for corn has come down a bit. Our prices have moved back up a little bit. There, for some producers out across the countryside right now, corn prices on the board today are at a slightly profitable level. Whereas when I look for soybeans, we're still in the hole a bit here. And arguably the biggest difference between the two crop is that corn has been able to grow exports and find ways that even as China falls off, we're still seeing growth, where soybeans is having a harder time replacing those sales we used to make into China.
Which, Chad, that makes sense then why you had your acreage numbers that came out at the
Yep,
end of March here.
you got it.
Exactly,
This
exactly
goes
what they
in
were.
line with that.
Yep, makes perfect sense with what you're saying.
It does. And so that's the deal. When we look at those acreage numbers now, you look at this graph, it's like, yeah, those two things fit together like a hand in a glove. And so, if you were, as we were talking before we started recording here, when you're looking here, does the acreage shift, does it make sense? It's like, yeah, given the finances as we stare at them right now, yeah, these are in line. Now, can a lot of things change between now and when we're done planting? Definitely is the case. One of the big things I'll be watching, and I'll flip all the way back here to that drought monitor map. When you think about that idea of that, right now we're dry, typically drier conditions out in the field do tend to lead to more corn planting and less soybean planting. But also, we know if we get delayed a little bit, especially as we get into, say mid-April and say a rain comes by and delays us and kicks us deeper into May, well, the more we get delayed, the more we see a shift back towards soybeans. Because you're looking at, okay, we're starting to shorten the season up. And I think most farmers are more comfortable shifting from corn to soybeans than necessarily dialing down the maturity on their corn that much.
So you're saying those June 30th numbers could switch, obviously weather dependent.
They definitely can. In fact, bear with me here. We're going to try something if it'll allow me to do it. Let's see here if I can get out of that. Here's a sign you're going to possibly be able to see what I've got on my screen, but I want this guy. So, Josh, I'm going to rely on you to tell me what you see on the screen.
You bet. I still see the original slideshow with
All right, so that
aerial
tells
capacity.
me I've got to. Where is. For some reason, I've lost the Zoom menu. Let's try stop share. And then what I'm going to do here is reshare. I want that guy. So in this case, I have switched
There you
to
go. Yep,
some
there's the green
USDA
fact
slides.
projected. Yep,
Yep.
perfect.
So in this case, what I want to take you to is okay, This is the big difference as you look at the March versus the June acreage estimates we get from USDA. What this is a graphic that shows you when they do those surveys and when do we normally plant. In this case, the yellow bar over here on the left. This is when they did the survey for the numbers they released at the end of March. They're doing at the end of February, the early half of March. Then you can see in these gray and black lines here, that is typical planting progress for corn and soybeans. We tend to start early, April on corn. Beans tend to start mid-April. And then you can see by the time we get into June, we're mostly done. And that orange bar tells you when they do the survey for the June acreage numbers. All right, what that says is there's a good 2 to 3 months worth of weather that happens in between. That definitely impacts whether we're on, timely with our plantings or not. Now, when we look at overall acreage numbers, what tends to happen, I want to skip forward to this guy, is this. This is looking at overall acreage across all the major crops. So that's what they call their principal crop intentions here. So this is looking at what did we tell USDA in March versus what did we end up actually getting planted. That's what they refer to as final acres. And so if you look back over the past decade, what this shows is if USDA misses, they're more likely to miss by overestimating total plantings as opposed to underestimating. And that's because if you think about it, we intend to plant as much as we can. But there are some years, and in this case, let me pick on 2019 because that's the classic example. That was a very wet year. We had a lot of folks that couldn't get planted. They took prevent planted because it was just too wet to get the crops in. And that's what tends to force us to adjust that acreage. Not only does it adjust and force us to plant fewer acres, but it also means that we do see some shifts between the crops. And one of the biggest ones for like a state like here in Iowa is we tend to say we're going to plant more corn in March, and then we end up planting a few more beans in June because we got delayed. But here you can see sort of what's the scale of that. And like I say, USDA, I mean, those estimates are actually pretty good. On average, they're within 1 million acres of where we end up. So where else you want to go, Joshua?
Well, let's put this together a little bit, Chad. And it seems to me that from what you're talking about, if you got your slides, pull those back up.
Sure. Which ones?
Let's do the one where you kind of showed we had feed demand, biofuels, and exports. So, for everybody out there trying to figure out where we're at, it seems like there we go. From what you were talking about in the livestock markets, feed demand, at least in the short term, not much hope for really increasing that. Is that accurate?
I'd say that's accurate. When you're looking here, for example, if you look at USDA's numbers, they do show about 125 million bushel gain there. I'm going to argue all that gains in the residual part of this because you notice they say feed and residual.
Right.
So when you're looking at corn demand, ethanol we measure on a weekly basis. Exports we measure on a weekly basis. Food, seed, and other we basically estimate every quarter. Feed demand's the hard one to really get on. And so when you look, what we end up doing is actually we figure out all the other uses and then look at how much is left in storage and then infer that that either was fed or it's the residual part, which is known as harvest loss. I would argue that that 125 million bushels worth of growth they've got here is basically them just saying, no, that's more harvest loss because they follow a really simple rule of thumb when it comes to this. When you're thinking about the residual usage in corn, a small crop has a small loss, a big crop has a big loss. And as we look at 2025, it's projected to be the biggest crop we've ever had. So we would expect a big harvest loss to go along with that.
I gotta hold that thought because I want to get your thoughts on, are we going to break 180 as a nationwide average? Might as well let's
Uh,
talk about that right now while I'm thinking
yeah.
about
Well, that's it. I will argue we can. I don't know if we'll pull it off this year. And in fact, I think one of the things everybody's watching to see is now that we now know that we're north of 95 million acres being projected, will we see USDA come back in and maybe knock that yield down a bit? Because we do know that as we expand corn area, we're going into more acres that um, are not traditionally corn land, that we should expect to see that yield degrade a bit. At the same time, too, though, I'll point us back. Go back to 2023, where we planted nearly 95 million acres. We saw an average yield of 177. And again, remember, 2023 was a drought year. In fact, when we looked here in Iowa, we saw some fairly significant drought impacts. What that also tells me is with a timely rain or two in 2023, we could have got the 180 back then. In fact, as you look at 2024, I could argue we thought we were north of 180 most of last year. So 180 is not out of the realm of expectations. Would it be a record? Yes. Right now, the record is the 179.3 that we did last year. But like I say, that just sort of proves that it could be done, especially if we do get more ideal weather conditions. And let's face it, we haven't had ideal conditions for the past few years, and we've been able to produce phenomenal crops.
it. Yeah, so you're looking at good growing conditions with the acres that are intended to be planted. So
Yep,
they're right in line potentially with 181, or weather dependent, it could be higher.
it could be higher. Then again, I mean, could this year be the time that the drought really takes a bite out of us? It's possible. And in fact, one of the things I'll tell you I'm watching is if you look at this map, I'll point out that area of red out there in Nebraska. What we're waiting to see is does that try to slide east? And that's actually what sort of happened if you want to think of it 2022 to 2023. We did see the drought impact western Iowa more in 2022. It impacted eastern Iowa more in 2023. The drought slid east. Now, at least everything I'm hearing from the climatologists that I've been listening to, they tell me that they think the West will stay dry, but at least right now it seems to be that the Gulf moisture stream is open. Hence, we're seeing the storms like we have over the past couple of weeks here. That's pumping moisture at least up here into places like Missouri, Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and further east. And so you are seeing some improvement in drought conditions, say, east of the Missouri River, but not west of the Missouri River.
Okay, so then if we're looking at the other two places where we can make up a potentially a big crop with demand, biofuels, it seems like SAF we're very hopeful for, but again, that's kind of long term. Short term, any positives that you can see in the biofuel space for demand?
Well, I'll put it this way, for the next year, no.
Okay.
I think we're where we're going to be. But as you think down the line, I mean, in this case, SAF, let's call that the grand goal. But let's call it an easier pathway to growth right now would be things like year-round E15. The idea is it may not make a lot of difference within the course of the next year, but as you look over a 2 to 3 year time horizon, if we can get nationwide E15, that will start to give the ethanol market room to grow again. And in this case, we're going to need to, if we do get nationwide E15, we would need to expand ethanol production. Because as it stands right now, to provide basically the 10% blend, we need somewhere around 15 billion gallons of ethanol. Well, right now we produce about 16, 15 for the domestic market, and about a billion gallons gets exported. If we go to nationwide E15 and can move that blend all the way up to that 15% range, that says that you would need to expand the ethanol production up probably north of 20 billion gallons. That means we would have to add a few more, production facilities or at least expand the ones we've got now to help create more ethanol to feed that additional demand through E15.
So then that leaves us with exports, which, as we've seen, has been really, really strong for corn.
Yep.
And
And that's the deal. I would argue
tariffs
that whether I'm looking corn or soybeans, that's the quickest short-term way within the next year to grow usage and demand for our crop side.
for both crops, both corn
Yep.
and soybeans, yeah. So I've got to ask, with obviously tariffs and markets a little bit on the downside today, always like to bring up the 1980s farm crisis, right? What why not, right? If my grandfather was alive today, he would just sit there and shake his head like, yeah, having to live through that time. Um, Obviously different time, different circumstances, but do you see any parallels or anything that farmers and landowners should be on the lookout for?
Well, I guess I would argue the parallel is, if you want to think of it this way, we have seen, you can see it in this corn table here. If you go down to the bottom line, prices have significantly fallen over the past couple of years. That's, reminiscent of what we went through during the farm crisis. But I'm going to argue that a lot of things, when you look at where U.S. ag is right now, we are still in much better shape now than what we went through during the 1980s. When you think about what happened then, well, the 1970s and early 1980s were actually a really rough time for agricultural income, but for some reason they weren't necessarily a rough time for agricultural land values until the crisis really hit us upside our heads in the mid 1980s. And that's what created, it was sort of a land boom and then bust that really created the ag farm crisis that we saw back then. When we look today, our land values are very strong and fairly resilient. That's mainly because when you look at our farm incomes, even though our prices are down, our incomes are still actually around our 20-year average. So if you think about it, if we look at where our income's set today and we compare that to the last 20 years of ag incomes that we've had, we're sitting in the middle of that. So we're not at the low end. We're no longer at the high end. We were there back in 2021 and 2022, but we're around average. Now, the reason it feels worse than that is because 2, 3 years ago, we were at record levels. And let's face it, as soon as we get higher levels of income, you get used to it very quickly. It's hard to adjust back down to the lower levels of income we're experiencing right now. And so, yes, the ag economy has softened. Yeah, I could probably argue that the ag economy itself is in a recession right now. But it's compared to historical recessions in the ag, like the farm crisis. The idea is, nope, we're not nearly that deep. And we have help is coming along the way. If you think about just the past couple of weeks here, um, you know, USDA has announced that well, they're known as the ECAP payments, the economic assistance package that was passed by Congress back at the end of last year. Those payments are going to start flowing out here over the next few weeks. That's going to inject about $10 billion into the agricultural economy, which will help boost some cash flow as we think about it. Beyond that, Congress also passed some disaster aid assistance that will roll out over this next year as well. Now, that's mainly targeted towards places like California with the wildfires and the hurricanes that hit the southeast, but we'll see some money here in the Midwest as well, for example, from the flooding that we saw last year. Well, that's going to add about another $20 billion into the agricultural economy. And so you can think of it as, yes, while our market economics are weak right now, there's enough government support coming in that it's putting us in a better spot than we feel like we're in right now. And it's providing arguably just enough cash flow that it helps us We're farming for this year, and we'll be farming again next year. That, we've got enough cash flow to keep going. It's not an easy year, but it's also not a devastating year like we had in the 1980s.
Now with the tariffs that we're going to be dealing with here, do you see more than likely in order to keep everything afloat? Of course, you've got the ECAP payments that are on their way right now. And I know the Ag Secretary yesterday was saying that more help could be coming on the way with these tariffs in place. Do you see that as something that we're probably going to need?
Yeah,
With just the way things are set up, as we've gone through this today.
they definitely help. I mean, that's the way I'm going to point out. I mean, if you think back to, President Trump's first term. In fact, let me go to that trade graph that we had here where I can show, you can see that big drop for China. And yeah, that created a hole in income, which the government decided to help fill in when we got market facilitation payments. You may recall them MFPs is what they were called back then. That helped smooth in, if you will, that filled in that pothole. What Secretary Rollins has been talking about is doing the same sort of thing, that as agriculture suffers these financial hits due to the tariffs, that she will look to use her power of the purse as Secretary of Agriculture to provide support to ag commiserate with those damages. And that's, right now, I would say if the tariffs are going to go on, then ag is going to, need some support coming in to help offset some of those losses. And it sounds like the administration is trying to be as prepared as they possibly can right now to do that.
Yeah, especially with what you've gone through today, like we were talking about, the place for growth, at least to help support commodity prices,
Yeah,
is exports. And that is the thing that's going to be hit the hardest.
that's going to be hit the hardest because, like I say, when you look here, and this has been true when you look last few years. Let me pick on corn since we've been talking a lot about that. Typically, if you want prices to rise in the corn market, one of the early indicators that I look for is about a year before prices start to rise, you tend to see export rise. The reason we got the $6.50 corn back in 2021 and 2022 is because we did see corn exports spike up in 2020. We did see, in fact, 2020 was our best export year when it comes to the number of bushels we moved into the international market. In fact, if you want to think about what are the top three right now, 2020 was number one, number two was 2021, and right now, number three is what we're doing right now in 2024 crop. So typically, I would think, yep, the boost we're seeing in exports now should hopefully lead to better prices for the 2025 crop. I think right now you can see that the market is hoping that could still happen. But USDA is sort of betting that the tariff situation and the increase in acres may overwhelm that possibility.
So that's what you look for on essentially a leading indicator of
Yeah.
where prices for the, you don't have a crystal ball, but where fundamentally prices should be headed is on the export
Well,
side.
that's the deal. I tend to look, you tend to look at what has been a signal, a good signal in the past. And I'm going to tell you, yeah, it's our international demand. It's our exports that tend to be a leading indicator because those export markets react very quickly to changes in available production and supply. When you think about the feed market, the idea is the feed market moves as fast as the biology of the animals. The idea is you can't magically increase the cattle herd by 10% overnight. It takes years to build a cattle herd. When you look at the ethanol industry, especially if the industry is running at near full capacity, which it is right now, it's hard for it to adjust up. I'd have to build another plant. That would take years. So when you're looking at these other demands, they move much more slowly, especially on the upside. So if you want that upside potential, the line that's going to give that to you here, especially if you need it very quickly, is the export line.
I think that's an important point. Chad, you've been so kind with your time today. I've got two things I want to end with here. Of course, being in the farm real estate market, kind of going back to what you're talking about before, you see land prices are probably where they should be currently.
Oh, well, that's the deal.
With the way
Yeah.
fundamentals are.
What the way fundamentals are. Like I say, incomes have been, over the past few years, relatively strong, and I would argue still today. Yes, they've fallen, but we're still around the 20-year average. And that's supportive of land values staying about where they are. Because again, when you look at agricultural land values, it should be tied to the income we derive from farming that land. And that income has been good over the past few years. Therefore, the land values should be strong. Now, that said, the longer we stick with lower corn and soybean prices, the more likely you could see some retracement in land values, but it's going to move much more slowly than the crop markets do.
That's important. Okay, lastly, as we get into our growing season here, as farmers, landowners, and people that just love agriculture, what are some of the main things that we need to pay attention to? Like,
Well,
what are your top two or three things?
yeah. Well, so one of the big things I'm going to be watching right off the bat is planting progress. So, I mean, the idea is, you know, what we've told USDA is we're going to plant a heck of a lot of corn. Let's see how quickly we move to get that crop to the ground. And like I say, especially the first 2, 3 weeks here, as we look out over the next 2, 3 weeks, those are big for the corn number because typically corn dominates the early planting season and then soybeans dominates the latter half. So if we have a good planting window, sort of as I look outside today, we're drying out. We're getting close to that early planting window. What is it? April 10th, April 11th is when you can plant and you're fully covered by crop insurance. If we stay like this, we should see a lot of corn being planted here in early April, supporting that number. So I'm definitely watching that. The other things I'm watching it will be in this case, I'm watching. There's a weekly export report that keeps track of these numbers. So I go back to these charts that I've had here. These guys. I'll use corn for example. Every week we get a snapshot. So the other thing I'm going to be watching here is, do we see a change in the trend for export sales given these new tariff announcements? How big a hit might we take here? Or do we, and this is what I think a lot of folks are hoping for, do we see sort of the pattern continue to remain sort of as it is, despite the tariffs being thrown around here? One of the things I was noticing, for example, is if you look at what the president announced yesterday, um, he specifically carved out Canada and Mexico and maintain that if the product is already been handled by the USMCA agreement, the tariffs don't apply there. Well, that might mean that we do see some of our ag exports unimpacted by at least the tariffs with Canada and Mexico. And hopefully, since they're some of our biggest trade partners, that could mean continued growth there despite tariffs going on in other areas. So those are the two big things I'm going to be watching over the next couple of weeks.
Awesome. Chad, I really want to thank you for your time today, your expertise, and appreciate you taking your time and helping everybody out, just trying to add value, which you do every single day.
I appreciate that. I'm glad to be of service.
Sounds great. Everybody, this will be available on the Substack page. And of course, if you need help with buying or selling a farm, yeah, give me a call.